January 31st, 1945, Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank T. McCoy's hands trembled slightly as he photographed the aircraft before him. An intact Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, marked with the tail number 76312. This can't be their standard configuration, he muttered. No Air Force would design bombers like this. The fuselage shimmered under the tropical sunlight, its long, tubular shape living up to the Allied nickname it had earned. Nearly 20 meters from nose to tail, the bomber rested on its tricycle landing gear like a colossal silver cigar laid across the airstrip. Its 25-meter wings stretched perfectly intact, and the twin 14-cylinder radial engines, each capable of producing over 2,500 horsepower, showed no visible damage. This was no wreckage salvaged from combat. It was a fully operational aircraft, abandoned intact as the Americans advanced. What truly seized McCoy's attention, however, the discovery that would transform Allied understanding of Japanese aviation philosophy, lay inside the wings. Crawling through inspection panels, he found the fuel tanks completely unprotected. No self-sealing rubber coating, no armor shielding, no fire suppression, not even a protective layer of insulation. Only thin aluminum, barely 2 millimeters thick, separated thousands of liters of aviation fuel from enemy bullets. Major McCoy, commander of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit in the Southwest Pacific, had examined dozens of downed Japanese planes, but nothing compared to this. The abandoned Betty, captured almost pristine during the liberation of Clark Field, revealed a design logic utterly foreign to Western engineers. It would take analysts months to absorb the implications. The cold mathematics of what McCoy uncovered would soon reshape American tactics and aircraft design for the remainder of the war. Every assumption U.S. pilots held about Japanese engineering priorities, about how much they valued performance over protection, speed over survival, was about to collapse under the weight of evidence found in this one airframe. The story of this revelation had begun. Over 4 years earlier, on December 8, 1941, smoke still billowed from Pearl Harbor. 82 G4M bombers and 26 older G3Ms lifted off from bases in Formosa. Their target, Clark Field, the main American air base in the Philippines. The strike achieved complete surprise. Arriving shortly after noon, the bombers flew at 20,000 feet, well beyond the reach of the base's anti-aircraft guns. 27 aircraft from the lead formation released over 600 bombs across the runways and hangars. Minutes later, 0 fighters swept in at treetop height, strafing anything that remained. Of 17 B-17 flying fortresses parked on the ground, 12 were destroyed instantly. Almost every P-40 Warhawk was reduced to burning wreckage. Within 45 minutes, U.S. air power in the Philippines had ceased to exist. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the few pilots to survive, later recalled from his bomb shelter, "They came in perfect formation, high above us, completely out of reach. Then the fighters dropped down and tore us apart. We couldn't even get one plane airborne." The Betty bombers climbed away untouched. The few American fighters that did manage to take off found only empty sky. The Japanese had proven their bombers' extraordinary range, launching from bases nearly 460 miles away, something no U.S. aircraft could match at that time. The Betty's first year in combat would prove devastatingly effective. On December 10, 1941, just 2 days after the Clark Field attack, 26 G4Ms joined G3M Nels in a mission that changed naval history. Their target was Force Z, the British task force built around the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. The Japanese formations approached with chilling precision. The Bettys carried Type 91 aerial torpedoes, 840 kilograms each, with 200-kilogram warheads designed for shallow water use, running just deep enough to cripple ships in coastal seas. Their attack was mercilessly effective. Prince of Wales, a 43,000-ton symbol of modern British naval power, absorbed at least 6 torpedo hits, along with direct bomb damage. Repulse, though agile, took 4 hits trying to evade. Anti-aircraft guns brought down a handful of attackers, but couldn't stop the synchronized waves. Both ships capsized within hours, Prince of Wales at 1320, Repulse at 1333. In less than 2 hours, 841 British sailors were dead. It was the first time in history that modern capital ships, fully alert and maneuvering, were sunk entirely by aircraft in open sea. Across the Pacific in early 1942, Allied pilots began to see Betty bombers in every major engagement. They struck with unnerving reach, Darwin from 1,500 miles away, Port Moresby from across New Guinea's mountains, Guadalcanal from Rabaul, 600 miles distant. No Allied bomber matched that range. Japanese forces could attack almost anywhere in the theater, while American fighters lacked the endurance to intercept them. For the first 6 months of the war, the Betty dominated the skies. But air combat evolves quickly. By mid-1942, American fighter strength grew. Wildcats gave way to Hellcats and Corsairs, and tactics improved. The Betty's vulnerabilities began to show. On August 8, 1942, 23 G4Ms from the 4th Air Group departed Rabaul to bomb U.S. positions on Guadalcanal. They were intercepted by American fighters near Savo Island. 18 of the bombers were destroyed. Over 120 airmen killed, in the deadliest single loss for the type. U.S. pilots reported the same thing in every engagement. The Betty ignited like a torch. 2 or 3 hits anywhere on the wings or fuselage were enough. New nicknames spread: Flying Cigar, One-Shot Lighter, Flying Zippo. When Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn arrived later that year, commanding VF-17's Corsairs, he described his first encounter. "We couldn't believe how fast they went up. Hit them anywhere, and they just burst into flame." The full reason for that fragility, the engineering trade-offs hidden beneath the Betty's sleek aluminum skin, would only become clear in 1945. When Major McCoy climbed into the wing of that abandoned bomber at Clark Field and realized it wasn't carelessness, it was design. The first significant intelligence breakthrough came in November 1942, when Australian forces overran Japanese airfields at Buna in Papua New Guinea. Among the abandoned aircraft, technical air intelligence units discovered Betty bombers with varying levels of damage. Initial examinations confirmed what pilots had reported. The fuel tanks had no protection whatsoever. Aeronautical engineers with the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit, Southwest Pacific, conducted the first detailed analysis. The wing access panels revealed fuel cells with no protective measures, thin aluminum construction, no rubber sealant layer, no protective coating, no fire suppression systems. Multiple Betty bombers examined at Buna showed identical characteristics. This was not battle damage or field modification. This was standard Japanese design. The implications were staggering. American bombers by 1942 universally featured self-sealing fuel tanks. The B-7 Flying Fortress had incorporated them from the B-17C model onward. The B-24 Liberator had featured them from the XB-24B prototype. Even fighter aircraft like the P-38 and P-47 featured protected fuel systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks used layered rubber compound that swelled on contact with fuel when punctured by bullets or shell fragments, sealing holes and preventing fuel loss and fire. The technology added substantial weight to aircraft, but dramatically improved crew survival rates. American military doctrine considered this weight penalty essential and non-negotiable. Yet here was Japan's primary land-based bomber produced in thousands, operating across the entire Pacific theater with fuel tanks that offered zero protection. The weight saved by eliminating self-sealing systems, armor plating, and fire suppression equipment was immediately apparent. But the cost in crew lives becoming equally obvious in lost statistics. that mounted with every engagement. The captured Betty at Clark Field in January 1945 would provide the most complete technical analysis. Major McCoy and his team spent 3 weeks dismantling and documenting every system. Their report, classified secret and distributed to all Allied air forces, detailed specifications that explained both the Betty's extraordinary capabilities and its catastrophic vulnerabilities. The G4M Model 1 specifications revealed an aircraft optimized ruthlessly for range and speed. Empty weight of 6,741 kg. Remarkably light for a bomber of its size. Maximum takeoff weight of 9,500 kilos. Fuel capacity of 4,780 L distributed across 8 unprotected tanks, 4 in each wing, positioned in the wing's center section where they were most vulnerable to combat damage. Top speed of 428 km perf, or approximately 265 meters per hour. Maximum range of 6,34 feet, exceeding 3,700 meters. Service ceiling of 8,500 meters. Crew complement of 7 members, including pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 2 gunners. The fuel system design was particularly revealing. The 8 tanks were arranged in 4 groups of 2 positioned along the wing's longitudinal axis, where the wing joined the fuselage. This placement maximized fuel capacity by utilizing the thickest portion of the wing structure, but it also positioned the tanks directly in the path of enemy fire during combat. Any attack from the side or below would inevitably strike fuel tanks. The aluminum construction provided no protection. The absence of self-sealing compounds meant that even small punctures would leak fuel continuously. American engineers calculated that the weight saved by eliminating protection systems exceeded 500 kg/tur. Aircraft, this weight savings translated directly into additional fuel capacity and extended range. But the cost and vulnerability was equally calculable. Combat reports showed that Betty bomber shit anywhere in the wing area exploded with near certainty. The unprotected tanks created what engineers termed a critical failure point, a single system whose destruction guaranteed loss of the entire aircraft. These numbers told the story of design choices made in September 1937, when the Japanese Navy issued requirements that would define the G4M's entire existence. Top speed of 398 km/h, cruising altitude of 3,000 meters, range of 4,122 unloaded, or 3,700 kilograms, carrying 800 kilograms of bombs or torpedoes. The requirements reflected Japanese naval strategy in the late 1930s. Japan's empire stretched across vast Pacific distances. Naval bases were separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. The Navy needed bombers capable of striking enemy positions far beyond the range of carrier aircraft. Bombers that could operate from land bases to support naval operations across the entire theater. Existing Japanese bombers fell far short of these requirements. The G3 bomber, then in service, had a maximum range of approximately 3,000 kilometers. American bombers like the B-7 had even more limited range in their early variants. No bomber in service anywhere in the world in 1930 7 could strike targets at the distances Japanese planners envisioned. The Navy's requirements were not arbitrary. They were calculated based on the distances Japanese forces would need to cover in any future Pacific conflict. From Formosa to the Philippines, 460 meters. From Rabaul to Guadalcanal, 600 meters. From Japanese home islands to potential targets across the Pacific, thousands of miles. The bomber that could meet these requirements would give Japan strategic reach that no other nation possessed, but the requirements also reflected assumptions about future warfare that would prove catastrophically wrong. Japanese planners assumed that surprise and initiative would provide protection for long-range bombers. They assumed that enemy fighter opposition would be limited by range and numbers. They assumed that the war would be decided quickly before enemy industrial capacity could generate overwhelming force. Every assumption would prove false. The man tasked with achieving the impossible was Kiro Honjo, who led the Mitsubishi design team after taking over from Joji Hattori. Honjo had studied bomber design at Junkers in Germany during the early 1930s, absorbing European aeronautical engineering principles and manufacturing techniques before returning to Japan. He understood immediately that meeting the Navy's requirements would demand compromises that Western air forces would never accept. Honjo assembled a team of engineers at Mitsubishi's Nagoya facilities to tackle the design challenges. The team analyzed every aspect of bomber design, calculating weight budgets for every component and system. They studied existing bombers from multiple nations, identifying where weight could be reduced without compromising structural integrity. They experimented with new construction techniques and materials that might offer weight savings. The mathematics were brutally simple. To achieve their required range, the aircraft needed massive fuel capacity. Each liter of aviation fuel weighed approximately 0.8 kg. 4,180 layers of fuel meant approximately 3,800 kg of a fuel weight at full load. To achieve the required speed with this fuel load, the aircraft needed minimal weight. Every kilogram added to the empty weight reduced either range or payload capacity. These two requirements existed in direct opposition. Fuel was heavy. Protection systems were heavy. Armor plating weighing hundreds of kg would be required to protect crew positions and vital systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks added substantial weight through the rubber compounds, and additional structure required. Fire suppression systems added weight. Redundant safety measures added weight. The cumulative weight of adequate protection would prevent achieving their required performance. Honjo made the decision that would define the G4M throughout its service life. Protection would be sacrificed for performance. The fuel tanks would be unprotected aluminum construction. No self-sealing compounds, no armor plating around fuel cells, no fire suppression systems beyond basic fire extinguishers, no redundant safety measures. Every kilogram saved would be invested in fuel capacity, range, and achieving the Navy's performance specifications. The decision was not made lightly. Honjo understood the risks. His team calculated the vulnerabilities that unprotected fuel tanks would create. They knew that combat damage to the wings would likely prove catastrophic, but they also knew that the Navy's requirements could not be met any other way with available technology. The choice was between an aircraft that met performance specifications with known vulnerabilities or an aircraft that failed to meet requirements but offered better protection. The Navy had demanded performance. Honjo delivered performance. The first G4M prototype flew on October 23, 1939. The aircraft met every performance requirement the Navy had specified. Speed exceeded expectations. Range surpassed projections. Payload capacity satisfied operational needs. The bomber entered production as the Navy Type 1 attack bomber with Mitsubishi building the aircraft at plants in Nagoya. Initial production models, designated G4M Model 1, began reaching operational units in April 1941. By December 1941, approximately 180 G4Ms were in service with the Japanese Navy. These aircraft would form the backbone of Japanese land-based air power. Throughout the Pacific War, the Betty's combat debut at Clark Field and against Force C demonstrated the wisdom of Honjo's design priorities in the specific conditions of early 1942. When facing limited opposition, when achieving surprise, when operating beyond the range of enemy fighters, the Betty was devastatingly effective. Its range allowed strikes from bases that enemies considered safe. Its speed permitted rapid penetration of target areas. Its payload delivered meaningful damage. But these advantages depended entirely on the assumption that Betty formations would face minimal opposition. The moment American fighter strength increased, the moment interception became routine, the moment sustained combat became inevitable. Every design choice that prioritized range over protection became a death sentence for crews. The Guadalcanal campaign exposed the fundamental flaw in the Betty's design philosophy. From August through October 1942, more than 100 G4M bombers were lost with their crews in what became a sustained bloodletting that Japanese Air Force could not sustain. The single mission on August 8th alone destroyed 18 of 23 aircraft, with approximately 120 aviators killed. The pattern repeated with brutal consistency throughout the campaign. Betty formations would depart from Rabaul, fly 600 millimeters to Guadalcanal, engage American fighters, and suffer catastrophic losses. August 9th saw additional bombers lost. August 10th brought more losses. By the end of August, the 4th Air Group had been effectively destroyed as an operational unit. September brought no respite. Betty formations continued striking American positions at Guadalcanal, and American fighters continued destroying them in overwhelming numbers. The mathematics were inexorable. Japanese forces needed to strike American positions to contest control of the island. Betty bombers provided the only means of delivering meaningful strike capability from Rabaul. But every mission resulted in losses that could not be replaced. October saw the pattern continue. American fighters' strength increased as more squadrons arrived at Henderson Field. Pilot quality improved as combat experience accumulated. Tactical doctrine evolved to exploit Betty vulnerabilities more effectively. Japanese losses accelerated even as the number of bombers available for missions declined. By November, when the Guadalcanal campaign effectively ended with Japanese withdrawal, Betty losses exceeded 100 aircraft. Crew casualties approached 700 men dead. The exchange rate was unsustainable. Japan's most capable land-based bomber had been rendered obsolete by its own vulnerabilities, transformed from a feared weapon into what American pilots called easy meat. Japanese planners had expected losses. All military operations involved casualties, but the scale of Betty losses exceeded every projection. Unprotected fuel tanks that permitted 6,000 km range also guaranteed that any hit to wings or fuselage would likely prove fatal. There was no middle ground, no wounded bombers limping home, no damaged but survivable aircraft. Betty bombers either returned untouched or exploded in flames. By mid-1943, Japanese engineers recognized that modifications were essential. Starting with the 663rd aircraft, produced in March 1943, 30mm rubber sheets were installed beneath wing surfaces, where fuel tanks were located. These sheets were not true self-sealing tanks. They were a compromise measure, adding minimal weight while providing limited protection against fuel leakage. The modification reduced top speed by 9 km/h. Maximum range decreased by 350 miles, but crew survival rates showed no significant improvement. The rubber sheets could slow fuel leakage from small-caliber hits. They could not prevent fires from larger-caliber rounds or cannon shells. They could not stop explosions when tracers ignited fuel vapor. The fundamental vulnerability remained unchanged. Japanese designers attempted more comprehensive protection with the G4M, Model 3 introduced in October 1944. This variant featured actual self-sealing fuel tanks with capacity reduced to 490L to accommodate the leak-blocking material. The modification reduced maximum range to 3,740 km, a loss of more than 2,000 km compared to the original G4M Model 1, while approximately 60 G4M Model 3 aircraft were produced by war's end. The modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect the Betty's combat record. By late 1944, American air superiority was so complete that no level of fuel tank protection would have permitted Betty bombers to operate effectively. The war's outcome had already been determined. The Betty's vulnerability became so notorious that American forces began using the aircraft in ways that highlighted the dangers Japanese crews faced. On April 18, 1943, the Betty bomber became the instrument of Admiral Ishizuroku Yamamoto's death in an engagement that demonstrated both American signals intelligence capabilities, and the aircraft's fatal weaknesses. American code rears intercepted Japanese communications indicating that Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18th. The admiral would travel aboard a G4M bomber with a fighter escort. 18 P-38 Lightnings from the 339th Fighter Squadron were assigned to intercept the flight, though only 16 actually flew the mission after one aircraft blew a tire on takeoff and another suffered drop tank failures. The mission required extraordinary precision. The P-38s would fly over 400 mat wavetop height to avoid radar detection, navigate across open ocean without landmarks, and arrive at exactly the calculated intercept point at exactly the calculated time. Any error in navigation, any deviation in timing would result in mission failure. The intercept had to occur within a narrow window when Yamamoto's aircraft would be vulnerable. The P-38s departed Guadalcanal at 07:25 hours. They flew at 50 ft above the ocean for over 400 meters, maintaining strict radio silence. Navigation was by dead reckoning and timing. The formation arrived at the calculated intercept point with precision that would become legendary in aviation history. At 09:34 hours, exactly on schedule, and exactly 1 minute ahead of the calculated intercept time, the P-38 spotted Yamamoto's formation. 2 Betty bombers flying at low altitude with 6 Zero fighters as escort. Captain Thomas Lanier and First Lieutenant Rex. Barber broke from the formation to engage the bombers while other P-38s held off the Zero fighters. Barber engaged the lead Betty bomber, which carried Admiral Yamamoto. The bomber took hits to the wing area, where the unprotected fuel tanks were located. The aircraft exploded in flames and crashed in the jungle. Yamamoto's body was recovered. The Toma following day, he had been killed by injuries sustained during the crash. The second Betty bomber also crashed, killing all aboard. The operation demonstrated multiple aspects of Allied superiority. American signals intelligence had intercepted and decoded Japanese communications. American planning had calculated intercept timing with 1-minute precision over 400 meters of ocean. American fighters had executed the mission flawlessly despite extraordinary navigation challenges, and the Betty bomber's vulnerabilities had guaranteed that successful interception would be fatal. There was no possibility of Yamamoto's bomber surviving once it came under attack. The unprotected fuel tanks ensured that any damage would be catastrophic. The Betty's vulnerability reached its most dramatic demonstration on March 21, 1945. 18 G4M bombers took off from Koya Air Base, each carrying an MXY-7 Oker rocket bomb beneath its fuselage. The Oker was a piloted rocket-powered aircraft with a 200-kiloton warhead designed for kamikaze attacks against American ships. The mission required the Betty bombers to fly within 20 kilometers of their targets before releasing the Oker aircraft. The Oker pilot would then ignite the rocket motor and dive at speeds exceeding 650 kilometers per hour toward American ships. The warhead's 1-200 kV explosives would destroy any vessel it struck, but the mission depended entirely on the Betty bombers surviving long enough to reach release range. The formation departed Kanoya at approximately 14:30 hours. The 18 G4M bombers flew in tight formation, with fighter escort heading toward American naval forces off Okinawa. Each bomber carried an Oker weapon beneath its fuselage, adding substantial weight and drag that reduced speed and maneuverability. The bombers were even more vulnerable than usual, unable to evade or maneuver effectively while carrying the Oker loads. American radar detected the formation at approximately 100 miles distance. F-6F Hellcat fighters from USS Hornet were scrambled to intercept. The Hellcats reached the Japanese formation well before it approached release range for the Oker weapons. In the engagement that followed, American fighters systematically destroyed the entire formation. The Betty bombers, already vulnerable under normal circumstances, proved completely helpless while carrying Oker weapons. The additional weight prevented evasive maneuvers. The external weapon created drag that reduced speed. The unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed that any hit would be fatal. One by one, the bombers exploded and fell into the ocean. Not a single Betty bomber survived to reach release range. Not a single Oker weapon was launched against American ships. 137 bomber crew members and 15 Oker pilots died in the attack. The mission represented the ultimate expression of the Betty's fundamental flaw. An aircraft designed to deliver weapons to distant targets could not survive to deliver those weapons when facing prepared opposition. The extraordinary range that made the mission theoretically possible meant nothing when the aircraft exploded before reaching weapon release range. The final mission flown by Betty bombers came on August 19, 1945, 4 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. 2 white-painted G4M bombers with green crosses departed at Sugi Airfield carrying Japanese representatives to discuss surrender terms with Allied forces. The aircraft given call signs Baton 1 and Baton 2 flew to Iosima, where the Japanese delegation transferred to an American C-54 for transport to Manila. The symbolism was profound and deliberate. The white paint and green crosses indicated peaceful intent, transforming the bombers from weapons of war into vehicles of diplomacy. The call signs Baton 1, Dahuinon Center, Ubati 1, and Baton 2 referenced the location where American forces had surrendered to Japan in April 1942, one of the most devastating defeats in American military history. Now, 3 years later, aircraft bearing those call signs carried Japan's surrender delegation. Lieutenant Den Sudo piloted one of the surrender aircraft, a G6M Model 1 transport variant converted from the bomber airframe. The transport variants retained the Betty's distinctive cylindrical fuselage and wing configuration, but carried passengers and cargo rather than weapons. The crew wore dress uniforms rather than flight suits. The aircraft carried no weapons, no ammunition, no military equipment of any kind beyond what was necessary for flight. The flight from Atsugi to Iashima covered approximately 1,000 kilometers, well within the Betty's range, even in transport configuration. American fighters escorted the White Betty bombers throughout their flight, ensuring they remained on the prescribed course. The escort was both protective and supervisory, guaranteeing safe passage while preventing any deviation from planned routes. The White Betty bombers with green crosses became the final image of the aircraft that had opened the Pacific War at Clark Field in December 1941. The circle was complete. The bomber that had destroyed American air power in the Philippines in the war's first hours now carried Japan's surrender delegation in the war's final days. The aircraft that had symbolized Japanese air power's reach and effectiveness now symbolized Japan's defeat and submission to Allied terms. The Betty's production statistics reflect both the aircraft's importance to Japanese operations and the terrible cost of its design philosophy. Total production reached approximately 2,414 aircraft across all variants, though some sources cite figures as high as 2,435 when including all prototypes and subtypes. The variation in total numbers reflects different methods of counting prototypes, subtypes, and transport variants. The G4M Model 1 comprised approximately 1,172 aircraft produced from 1941 through early 1943. This variant featured the original unprotected fuel tank design with capacity of 4,780 L. Top speed reached 428 km per hour. Maximum range of 6,034 km made it the longest-ranged bomber in service anywhere in the world. But the complete absence of protection systems made it catastrophically vulnerable once American fighters' strength increased. The G4M Model 2, with increased fuel capacity and slightly higher speed, accounted for approximately 1,442 Aerodabantus, examples produced from 1943 through 1945. This variant increased fuel capacity to 6,040 round, 1,190 L, extending maximum range even further. Top speed increased slightly to 437 feet, 15.22 but the Model 2 retained the fundamental vulnerability of unprotected fuel tanks. The modifications improved performance without addressing survivability. The G4M Model 3, designated Model 34, represented the only variant with actual self-sealing fuel tanks. Production began in October 1944, but only 60 to 91 aircraft were completed by war's end depending on source. The self-sealing tanks reduced fuel capacity to 4,490 L to accommodate the leak-blocking material. Maximum range decreased to 3,640 kilometers, a loss of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the Model 1. The modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect combat outcomes. The G6M transport variant, converted from bomber airframes, added another 30 aircraft. These transport versions carried passengers and cargo, rather than weapons, serving in liaison and communications roles. The G6M Model 1, used for one of the surrender aircraft in August 1945, represented this variant. Production continued through August 1945, with final aircraft completed just days before Japan's surrender. Mitsubishi factories produced Betty bombers at peak rates of approximately 100 aircraft per month during 1943. Production decreased in 1944 and 1945 as Allied bombing disrupted Japanese industry and as resources were diverted to fighter production for homeland defense. These production numbers made the Betty one of Japan's most numerous bombers, exceeded only by some fighter types in total production. Over 4 years of war, Mitsubishi delivered approximately 2,400 aircraft to Japanese Navy units across the Pacific theater. The bombers served in every major campaign, participated in every significant naval engagement, and struck targets across distances spanning thousands of kilometers. But production statistics tell only part of the story. Loss rates tell the rest. Few Betty bombers survived to war's end. The overwhelming majority were destroyed in combat, consumed by the fires that the unprotected fuel tanks made inevitable. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, only a handful of operational Betty bombers remained in service. The aircraft that had numbered in hundreds in 1942 had been reduced to dozens by attrition that no amount of production could replace. The casualty statistics among Betty crews were similarly devastating, though exact numbers remain difficult to verify from available records. What is certain is that thousands of Japanese aircrew died in Betty bombers, their deaths made nearly inevitable by the aircraft's fundamental vulnerabilities. The unprotected fuel tanks created conditions where survival depended entirely on avoiding combat damage. Once hit, Betty bombers rarely survived. Once on fire, they never survived. The crews understood these odds and flew anyway because military discipline and cultural values demanded that they accept the risks regardless of consequences. Surviving Betty crews were unanimous in their assessment. The aircraft's unprotected fuel tanks made survival a matter of pure chance. No amount of skill, no tactical innovation, no courage could compensate for the fundamental vulnerability built into every G4M. Former Flight Petty Officer Masawato, who completed 28 combat missions before transfer to training duties, offered the most direct summary. The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. We flew it because we were ordered to fly it. We died in it because that was what it was designed to make us do. The comparison with Allied bomber protection systems highlights the stark difference in design philosophy. The B-17 Flying Fortress featured armor plating protecting pilot and co-pilot seats, with steel plates ranging from 0.3 to 0.31 in thick. Armored bulkheads protected crew positions throughout the fuselage. The Bombardier position featured armored glass. Waist gunner positions included protective shields. Self-sealing fuel tanks were standard from the B-17C model onward. Introduced in 1941, the B-25 Mitchell incorporated similar comprehensive protection. Pilot and co-pilot seats featured armor backing. Fuel tanks included self-sealing compounds from early production. The B-25's empty weight of approximately 1,100 kilos reflected the substantial weight penalty of protection systems, roughly 2,000 kilos heavier than the Betty. Despite similar size and role, the weight penalty for Allied protection systems was substantial and accepted as necessary. American studies during the war demonstrated the effectiveness of crew protection measures with statistical precision. Body armor reduced thoracic wound fatalities from 36% to 8%, a reduction of more than 75% in deaths from chest wounds. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire-related casualties by similar margins. Aircraft equipped with protected fuel systems showed survival rates 3 to 4 times higher than unprotected aircraft when damaged in combat. Protected crew positions increased survival rates in damaged aircraft by providing shielding from shell fragments and small arms fire. Armored glass prevented pilot casualties from head-on attacks. Bulkheads compartmentalized the fuselage, preventing fire or damage in one section from spreading throughout the aircraft. The comprehensive approach to crew protection reflected American doctrine that trained crews represented assets more valuable than aircraft, which could be replaced more easily than experienced combat veterans. The weight cost for this protection exceeded $1,000 in most American bombers, but American industrial capacity permitted this weight penalty without sacrificing production numbers. American factories produced over 12,000 B-17 bombers and nearly 10,000 B-24 Liberators during the war. The production capacity meant that American forces could field large numbers of protected bombers without compromising capability. Japanese doctrine reached different conclusions. The Betty's design embodied a deliberate gamble. That range and offensive reach were worth more than the lives of its crew. Japanese engineers operated on the belief that surprise and initiative would provide all the protection they needed. They assumed enemy resistance would remain limited, and that the war itself would be swift and decisive. Every one of those assumptions collapsed in flames. By mid-1942, American fighter strength had expanded to the point where intercepting Betty bombers became almost routine. By late that year, U.S. pilots had learned to exploit every weakness in the aircraft's construction. By 1943, G4M missions amounted to suicide assignments. By 1944, the bomber could scarcely appear in daylight without being hunted down. The arithmetic of the Betty's war was written in smoke and wreckage. The same attributes that made it formidable in early 1942 became meaningless under sustained combat. Long range no longer mattered when aircraft ignited before reaching their objectives. Speed offered no salvation when Allied fighters could engage from distant airstrips. Payload capacity meant nothing when entire squadrons were annihilated before releasing a single bomb. Trond, inspection of tail number 76312 at Clark Field in January 1945 told the whole story. The unprotected fuel tanks that stunned Major McCoy were not an accident, not an emergency measure, and not a mistake in engineering. They were the product of deliberate design, a conscious trade-off by engineers who valued performance over protection. The Betty was exactly what the Japanese air staff had ordered. An aircraft of exceptional range and speed, built as light as possible to meet strict mission requirements. Armor and self-sealing tanks were excluded because they made the desired range impossible. Within the framework of 1937 technology, the decision seemed logical. Within the reality of a prolonged attritional air war, it was ruinous. The Betty became an emblem of Japan's readiness to endure catastrophic losses in exchange for tactical capability. A grim reflection of a military culture that prized mission success above crew survival. When American analysts disassembled the intact bomber at Clark, they were not merely studying a captured aircraft, they were uncovering the physical embodiment of pre-war assumptions that had already cost thousands of lives. The unprotected tanks were not a flaw. They were policy, from the opening days of the Pacific conflict to its final moments. The G4M served Japan faithfully, sinking battleships, destroying airfields, and striking distant targets across thousands of kilometers of ocean. Yet its legacy was written not in victories, but in loss statistics that surpassed every prediction. The same aircraft that had once obliterated Clark Field ended the war repainted in white with green crosses, carrying Japan's surrender envoys. The crew of 763-12 had simply walked away, leaving behind a machine whose very design made survival in combat nearly impossible. Most crews were not so lucky. They took off knowing the odds and perished in burning skies, victims of their aircraft's fatal compromises. The Betty's story is ultimately a lesson in the cost of performance without protection. It shows that speed, range, and payload mean nothing when bought at the expense of human survivability. Its impressive 6,000-kilometer reach ceased to matter when aircraft failed to complete the last 100. Its 428-kilometer-per-hour speed was useless against radar-guided interceptors. Its bomb load meant nothing when no one lived to release it. The G4M's history underscores a brutal truth: that technology divorced from realistic combat. Conditions creates weapons that destroy their users as surely as their enemies. The assumptions that guided its creation: a short war, limited opposition, decisive strikes, disintegrated within months of Pearl Harbor. By the time those illusions were shattered, hundreds of Bettys were already in production, and Japan's industry lacked the means to correct their flaws. The designers of 1937 knew the risks. They calculated the trade-offs, weighed the armor penalties, and accepted the consequences, convinced that range would decide the war. They were wrong, and countless aviators paid with their lives. The Betty's legacy reaches beyond aviation history into the moral calculus of warfare itself. How much risk to human life is acceptable for performance gains? American engineers chose to build machines that brought their crews home. Japanese engineers chose to build machines that reached the target, no matter the cost. One approach produced a sustainable air force. The other consumed its own. The study of tail number 763-12 confirmed what Allied intelligence had long suspected. The G4M was not a poorly built aircraft. It was brilliantly engineered to fulfill a vision, one that did not include its crew's return. And in that single truth lies the essence of Japan's defeat in the Pacific.